Just give another minute or so. Allow folks to arrive if they're coming. Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome. So good to see all of you here for the regular Tuesday tune-in. So as usual, our program will be some guided meditation for about half an hour, and then I'll offer a Dharma reflection, and we'll have some time for Q&A. And yeah, I think we're gonna practice some of the sense bases, maybe not all 6 of them, but some number of sense bases, just to get really in the body. So you can go ahead and begin to settle into your posture. Oftentimes some movement is good, just to loosen up any tension or any habitual leaning toward the computer. Really sensing the body supported by your seat. And allowing the belly to relax and soften. Feeling the natural stability of the body. And using that natural, stable foundation as a base for coming into an upright posture. The bones of the spine lining up. And the neck also coming into alignment. Perhaps also finding that the chest can soften and relax. And now turning the attention to the hands and receiving any sensations of touch that are happening moment by moment in the hand. Staying curious about sensations of touch in the hand. And beginning to notice the feeling tones of the sensations of touch. Are they pleasant or neutral or unpleasant? Still resting the mind on the sensations of touch. And now a shift in attention to sensations of hearing. Just receiving sensations of hearing. No need to strain to listen. Just allowing sensations of hearing to become apparent. Attending to hearing in each moment. In a receptive way. Perhaps also beginning to notice the tones, the sensations of hearing. unpleasant or pleasant or neutral. Staying curious about sensations of hearing. And now another shift in attention to the mind as a sense organ. So observing thoughts and mental activity as mere sensations in the mind. Thoughts just like sounds or smells. And because the mind is not contained in the body, it's a much more vast space in which thought arises. Just staying curious about mental activity as sensations in the mind. And perhaps also noticing the feeling tones of thoughts, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Lovely. That was our meditation for this evening. And so I'm going to go ahead and move into the Dhamma reflection. So feel free to adjust your posture, do whatever gets comfortable. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So tonight I really want to talk a little bit about everyday practice. And by that I mean the kind of practice that feels everyday, feels like something that's just a part of what you do. And the reason for this is in part because, sometimes we can get started talking about some very rarefied states or some kinds of things that you may or may not feel that you can observe in your own experience at this time in your practice, this time in your life, in your body. And yet the path is not limited to that. The path is not exclusively the purview of some extremely rare group of people or group of states of mind. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in order to really stay on this path, which is a gradual path, we need to be able to find it in these very simple ways, these very straightforward, day-to-day kinds of practices. And know that that too has its effect, has ways of transforming our experience, transforming our understanding of what's happening here in this body and mind. And so in order to do that, I brought a couple of ancient teachings from some very interesting folks who did experience some rarefied states, but we'll talk more about the part before that, before we get to what they said about that. So I want to share, I'm going to start out by sharing a poem. And the reason is because tonight's talk, I don't know if any of you saw the social media posts, tonight's talk is about 5 doorways to freedom. 5 different doorways to freedom. And I don't want to say what the 5 are just yet, because we're going to kind of walk through them in a way that hopefully you'll pick up on the ones that are most suitable for you, and it will become more obvious what that means as we go along. But to start out with, I wanted to read you a poem by Venerable Terry Uttama. So this is, I'm using the translation by Charles Hallisey. Charles Hallisey. He's an academic with Harvard University. He's a long timer there. And before I even read the poem, I just want to say something about what he says about the Therigatha as poetry. So the Therigatha, Theri means elder in the feminine form in the Pali language. So one of the elder nuns, elder in terms of senior within the order, not necessarily elder in terms of age. And Gata or Gata, as some folks would know it because of the Sanskrit pronunciation, Gata or Gata is the verse. The verse. So these are the verses of the elder nuns of the Buddha's time. And they were considered elder for their time in the order and also because of their accomplishments as practitioners. And so it's interesting because I imagine them, I always think about this, it's still to this day, monastics who practice Vinaya, we get together in groups to recite our precepts on the new moon and on the full moon. And the reason that it's done on those days, I believe, is because that made it easy for people who were far away to know when they needed to start walking to get back to their group. They could just look up at the sky and know, oh, the moon will be full in 3 days. So the day after tomorrow, I need to start walking to get back to my group so that we could recite the precepts together. And it's a time also when we would, of course, talk about our practice and receive teachings. And of course, at that time, receive teachings from the Buddha as well. But it's a time of community, you could say, when they would come together. And so I imagine the nuns coming together like this, under a full moon somewhere, sitting around and reciting poetry to each other, like saying something about their practice in this very poetic way. And then that got carried along and saved and adjusted, I would suppose. In fact, Hallisey speaks about that, about Pali as a language that most likely was not what they were speaking at the time, but a language that was used for a while to even out the regional differences in that part of India when they were trying to capture the Dhamma. In any event, he says, we should know that the Therigatha is one of the oldest collections of women's poetry, if not the oldest surviving collection of women's poetry in the world. And he says, the poems vary in quality as poetry, to be sure, but some of them deserve not only the adjective first in the historical sense, they also deserve to be called great because some of them are great literature. They are literature in the way that Ezra Pound meant when he said, literature is news that stays news. Literature is news that stays news. So this is news from the time of the Buddha, from Venerable Mahateri Uttama. She says, 4 times, 5 times, I went out from the monastery, heart without peace, heart out of control. I approached the nun. She seemed like someone I could trust. She taught me the Dhamma about what makes a person, about the senses and their objects, and about the basic elements that make up everything. I listened to what she taught and did exactly as she said. For 7 days, I sat in one position, legs crossed, given over to joy and happiness. On the 8th day, I stretched out my feet after splitting open the mass of mental darkness. So she ends by saying that she has awakened, but she begins by talking about this struggle, this inner struggle, right? The heart without peace, the heart that felt out of control. It's actually chitta is the word, so heart, mind, right? The mind. And her backstory is kind of interesting. She was said to have been born into the family of a banker in Savatthi. So the merchant class was just emerging really at this time of society when the Buddha was teaching. And it's said that as a very young woman, she heard Patachara preach. So she heard one of the other nuns. And Patachara is extremely well known. She had many, many students. She's a very, very inspiring nun, apparently. But lots of people wrote verses about her, actually. So Uttama heard her give a talk and was so motivated by the talk that she became a nun. And it said she made some spiritual progress, but she could not go all the way. And when Venerable Mahateri Patachara saw this, she gave her some further instructions. And that's what this verse is about. What were the further instructions that she got? So she taught me the Dhamma about what makes a person. That's how Halsey is translating the word for khandhas. So, many of you have heard different talks about the 5 khandhas: form, the body, and then 4 aspects of the mind. Those are the aggregates, what we call the aggregates, 5 aggregates. And then the senses, the 6 senses, and their objects. So we didn't do all 6 senses. We only did 3 of them tonight for the sake of calm and clarity. But the 6 sense bases are your usual ones: touch, taste, smell, seeing, hearing. And then the mind as a sense base, right? And thoughts and mental activity as sense activity, as the sense activity of the mind, so to speak. So that was the ayatana. And then the dhatus. The dhatus are like basic elements or basic ways that they spoke about conditionality. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this poem, besides mentioning some of these frameworks, is that she specifically says she had been struggling with this feeling of not having any peace and feeling out of control. And so she went and she approached somebody to receive a teaching, and she listened to the teaching. She says, I listened to what she taught and did as she said. So she listened to the teaching and then she put it into practice. Right. And then what happened? And then she felt so much joy and happiness that she got into a very, very steady sitting state. Joy and happiness, piti and sukha in this case. So meditative forms of joy and happiness. And so this listening to the teaching is one very simple way, one very simple doorway, you could say, to a very deep practice, right? To deep experiences in practice. In fact, to the ultimate, so-called ultimate experience in practice of having dispelled all sorts of delusion, all delusion. So Uttama Terry is basically telling us in her poem something about the value of both looking for the teaching when you encounter that problem, that difficulty, when you feel that you're struggling, and listening to the teaching. And in fact, there's another sutta in the numbered discourses in which the Buddha is talking about listening leading to inspiration. And then that inspiration leads to my very favorite kind of Buddhist joy, pamoja. Pamoja, which is the joy of reflecting on your own practice, reflecting on the good stuff that you're doing with your practice. Being mindful, developing compassion, beginning to understand your mind better, beginning perhaps to have better speech, the way you talk with other people or listen to other people, right? So all kinds of joy that comes out of the basic inspiration in the Dhamma, and the Dhamma as a possibility for your own life, and the Dhamma as an instruction that's relevant to you. And he begins this sutta by talking about listening, and listening as an inspiration or listening as a tool for inspiration, and the inspiration leading to that joy, the pamoja, and that joy leading to meditative states of joy, those stronger kinds of both embodied joy and the kind of low. So piti is this very strong, stimulated embodied joy most of the time, and sukha, a more mellow kind of contented hum in the background. And that leading to samadhi, leading to absorption. And I think some of you have heard me say this before, that finding joy in your practice is a key ingredient. And in fact, if we look at these 5 doorways for freedom, every single one of them starts this way. There's a practice, and then based on that practice, you find some inspiration which brings you joy. And then you practice it, and it leads to even more joy in the meditation itself. And that joy leads to the ability to focus the mind, to unify the mind. Because the mind is more willing to stay with what's pleasant, usually more willing. So that's the first of the doorways. It's just listening to the Dhamma. Just listening to the Dhamma. And goodness knows that today you have plenty of opportunities for that, right? There are recordings, there are audio recordings, there are video recordings, there are live streams happening, there are actually live retreats happening again, now that the pandemic is abating. And so this is a very simple doorway to step through. And then the second doorway is about teaching what you've heard. Teaching in detail what's been learned and what's been memorized. So this is an interesting one because this says many things, but one thing that I would like to bring out about what this says is that the Dhamma can be shared by folks who are not necessarily enlightened beings and still be beneficial. In fact, that was one of the things that the Buddha advocated, that some folks would go out and share the Dhamma in preparation for some later stages of their practice, in preparation for receiving some later teachings. So it's an interesting way to think about it, that when you want to share the Dhamma with someone, the Dhamma that you've learned and recited, that can help you to clarify actually things, or to know where it's not clear. Somebody was saying to me, I forget who it was saying to me that, oh yeah, that she was, there's a friend who was saying she was teaching on one of the schemes. What was it? I think it was the sense basis. But in any event, she was teaching on one of the frameworks. And she said, I've taught it like 3 or 4 times now, because each time I run into some part where it's a little foggy, where it's a little not clear. And I didn't notice until I started actually teaching this to my other friends in my group there, my meditation group. So that's an interesting way to think about it. And it leads to the same thing. It leads to some inspiration in the Dhamma, and then some pamoja, some joyful reflection on being a practitioner, and then piti and sukha. So the kinds of meditative joy, and then to that, again, that ability to focus the mind and unify the mind. And perhaps another one of these everyday, what I consider a kind of everyday doorway, is reciting the Dhamma. So chanting the Dhamma or reading aloud. Just that. Just hearing the Dhamma in your own voice. Hearing the Dhamma in your own voice can open up different ways of thinking about it, different ways of experiencing it. I mean, for one, chanting Dhamma, I would say, is a very, very moving practice. It's a very energetic practice. It's something that I often suggest to people who are experiencing depression or who are experiencing a lot of tightness in the body. Chanting can be a really good way of getting the energy moving. Right? It requires you to put it out there. And recitation to a lesser degree, but similarly, right? It's a way of having the Dhamma come out of your own body. And that, for whatever reason, always brings it a little closer to home, right? It brings it a little closer to home. And some folks actually pick their Buddhist tradition. It's been said to me numerous times. Some folks actually pick which tradition they're going to practice and by which chanting makes sense to them or which chanting resonates with them. Like it's a little bit sometimes of perhaps a karmic thing or something about the language or particular teachings that sound right for whatever reason. So it really can be very moving. And again, the same path, right? Inspiration in the meaning and the Dhamma and the practice, and then joyful reflection on the practice, and then joy and absorption in the meditation. And then there is thinking about a teaching. Just thinking about it. Not even doing it, not even listening to somebody else talk about doing it, not even saying it, chanting it, just thinking about a teaching quietly in your own mind, considering a teaching, examining it in the mind. is also a doorway to complete liberation, to full freedom. Just thinking about it. So the example that I want to share about this is a story, another one of my stories from Japan. I'm kind of sharing a lot of that time frame these days. And it's a story about one of those moments when everyday life suddenly looked a little different. So there I was, and I was practicing at Hoshinji, which is a training monastery, just about an hour and change northwest of Kyoto. And it's summertime, and that means that it's very, very hot and very, very humid. And there is no such thing as air conditioning in the monastery. We're talking about 500-year-old Japanese buildings made out of woven mats called tatami and rice paper walls, and maybe a little bit of drywall here and there just to keep the thing up, and some wood and glass outer windows. So we were going to have this meeting because some monks had gone off to another meeting and they were supposed to come back and report the information from the meeting they went to. And so in their grace, the leaders of the monastery, the sort of head monastics, handed out some paper fans. We each got a fan because it was hot and we were going to have to go to this meeting together. And it was a little oval fan, blue fan like this, oval with a little white plastic handle, blue paper. And everybody got one. So I put mine on my desk and I said, okay, so tonight we'll go to this meeting, and it's not translated. So I'm not going to understand anything of what's being said, virtually anything, because my Japanese is horrible, is terrible. And they're talking about who knows what, complicated topics. So fine, but I'm going to the meeting. And as I went to pick up my fan off my desk to go to this meeting, it had all these little white dots on it that looked random to me when I first set it down. But then as I went to pick it up to go to the meeting, I looked at the fan again, and I saw actually that the dots were the constellations in the night sky. It was a map of the night sky. So this blue background and these little white dots, and it actually represents the constellations. And I thought, of course, in my sarcasm in my head, I thought, oh, isn't that great that instead of going and sitting outdoors where it's cooler underneath the actual night sky, we're going to take our little fans with a drawing of the night sky and go sit in this very tight, fluorescently lit room in the middle of the monastery, all 20 of us packed in to this tiny room and no air conditioning. So, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go use, and that's what we do, right? We as human beings have a tendency to put the concept on the thing, right? And then that concept becomes the thing that we're relating to instead of the thing itself. So there we go. We sit down to this meeting. There's 20 of us monastics in this very small, again, very small, tight, hot, humid room with these great big fluorescent lights making it even hotter. And the guy at the front of the room, the head monk, the monk who was the one who ran the meditation hall, is up there talking in Japanese. Da, 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 da. And I was sitting next to my friend Ryudo-san, and Ryudo-san was a very short, very enthusiastic monk who had been a farmer in his previous life before becoming a monk. But he loved being a monk, and he was very, very energetic guy. And he was sitting next to me, and he also had his fan. So Ryudo-san is there fanning himself, and I am just like melting into the floor. It's too hot. Even the fan is not going to help. I'm really just, and I can't understand anything that's being said. So I'm literally just sitting there and just feeling the heat and letting the sounds wash over me, and watching Ryoda-san fan himself. And then there comes a moment where Ryoda-san flicks his fan, he flicks the fan, and the whole thing turns white. So no more blue with little white dots, no more map of the night sky. It just all looked white. And then flick again, and then the blue came back with the white dots. And then flick again, and the whole thing, whoosh, was white. And in that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, this is what we mean when we talk about the universal is completely present in the specific. The white represents the universal, and it was just this characteristic, this kind of inherent characteristic in the fan. It's just the paper catching the light, actually, the fluorescent light. And the map of the night sky represents the specific, the details, right? And so in that moment, for whatever reason, it was just kind of like, whew, like here's real, regular, conditioned, specific, detailed life in this map of the night sky of the constellations. And then click, here's the universal, where all of that is wiped out. Where there is no more conditionality, but there is this inherent characteristic, which is true of everything, the whole thing. The stars and the spaces in between them, and fan went beyond fan. So I tell this story because it was, if I had just had that moment of like, oh, look, the fan turns white, without the other piece of it, then it would not have been any learning, let's say. There would not have been any particular learning from that. It would just be like, oh, right. It caught the light or whatever. But somehow that all that history of Dhamma like suddenly was showing itself in a way that I could stop to think about. And I did, because why? Because I wasn't listening to other stuff that was going on. And I was in this embodied space where I could just watch. So this is what we mean when we talk about considering the teaching. Those moments are always here, but there are some moments that are more obvious than others, where there can be a very clear shift. And that when that shift happens, it's really important to stop and think about it. Stop and think about it. What is it that this means? What's going on here? And connect it back to the Dhamma. So that's the fourth doorway to freedom. Is actually taking those moments in which impermanence or suffering or conditionality or the universal or any number of other principles, it comes out at you. It shows itself a little bit. Taking those moments and stopping and reflecting on them. And then the fifth of the doorways is when the object is properly comprehended with wisdom, is attended to and comprehended with wisdom. And this, I would suggest, has to do with looking at looking at it from the perspective of not related to me. This is looking at objects from the perspective of just phenomena. And so this one, again, it says specifically it's a meditative object. So this is a kind of practice that does happen on the cushion. And it can become, I would say, a sort of habitual position to take, which is a nice thing when that happens. But looking at objects properly conditioned with wisdom is another way of sparking. So each one of these is doing the same thing. What is it doing? It's sparking the inspiration in the Dhamma, inspiration in the meaning, and then from that, the joy of reflecting on your practice, the joy of meditation, and the focus of the mind, the settledness of the mind, the unification of the mind can come together. So I invite you to think about the everydayness of listening as a practice, or reciting whatever verse feels inspiring and uplifting to you, or chanting, or sharing, teaching the Dhamma to someone. Hey, I heard about this or that way of practicing. Or this meditation, which very clearly focuses on the conditions not belonging to me, not defining me. So think about these everyday ways of bringing that joy into your life, because they can take you far. They can take you very far. Thank you for listening.